Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Terminator Salvation. So, for me, I can almost say that Terminator Salvation does actually complete the whole Terminator story to me. Like, I could just say, like, oh, okay, well, I could go right into Terminator Salvation and jump back into Terminator 1 and, like, feel like that story is completed. But unfortunately, Terminator had made so much money within this franchise, or really with just this thing alone, that they kept popping out movie after movie after movie until basically we end up having it to where James Cameron re-owns the rights now, and we'll see eventually if Terminator ever gets to be done yet again at this point. Because reasonably, with how the rights are done, it's going to be a very difficult thing to see if a Terminator movie is ever going to get done again. Going into Terminator Salvation, I honestly think that there are some really good choices within casting of this movie. A lot of people could have a wide variety of different feelings about this film. Some people could honestly hate Terminator Salvation. Some people could find this movie fun and can tolerate it. Some people might actually think that this is a really great film, which I can feel all kinds of wide spectrums. But for me, I would probably say mainly that I just find this movie to be action-packed fun. And plus also, we really have it to where finally we have a Terminator movie that is done in the future. And that is what I can actually like about this film, is we get the future Terminator period, where instead of us just going like, okay, here's John Connor who now has to try to consistently try to avoid Judgment Day, in this movie we finally get the aftermath of Judgment Day. We finally get to showcase what this future is going to be like. Yeah, they adjusted and retconned and changed and whatever after that, but we have this movie that really helps and leads us up to the very original film. And again, I can appreciate that. Interestingly enough, we end up having this movie that is not actually carried by John Connor or Kyle Reese or Sarah Connor or Arnold Schwarzenegger's Terminator. No, we end up having a guy named Marcus Wright, who is Sam Worthington, who I can understand after watching this movie why he headed on into bigger and Avatar-like things. Because this guy can easily carry a film, and plus, really, I thought that every little bit of things that he was doing in this film, I love his aggressiveness. I like the fact that we end up having this character who is a person that we have to root for, but he can't even root for himself, because we end up having this character who has this inner turmoil going on, and we end up having this character being very much a reminder of a character like Wolverine, to be brutally honest. We end up having this character who is convincing people that he's not a good guy, and that we end up having him contemplating whether it is possible for him to get a fresh start, a second chance. And interestingly enough, we end up seeing a person seeing him as a ally, but we also have, on the other opposite end of the spectrum, we also end up having people seeing him as an enemy. So it becomes a very intriguing story. I like the fact that we end up having Marcus Wright's character just being added into here, and then all of a sudden he just starts to just carry the movie, and we end up having to be really intrigued, just going, that's kind of strange that that we don't have John Connor carrying this film, or we don't have Kyle Reese carrying this film, or we don't have somebody from the previous movies carrying this film. It's very odd. It's kind of a very jarring like experience for how they go on to their own route of doing things. Man, do I love the big, gigantic robots or the big flying mechanisms within this movie. We also have it to where this film not only prepares us for the very first Terminator film, but on top of that, it actually does have a lot of continuity between the very last film, which of course was Rise of the Machines. We end up having a machine that ends up popping up in the fairly beginning of this film that actually is fairly reminiscent to the robot that which was in Skynet and Rise of the Machines. And watching this now, I was like, wow, that is really fascinating how there actually is continuity between films. I actually thought that that was really refreshing. Because I just thought that this was completely its own thing. But actually, it has some ties to otherwise the previous film. So, going in here, I actually just, no matter how people feel about this movie, it's still just good, action packed fun. That's what this movie has to be. I actually thought that this movie is a movie that I honestly just could enjoy the story, enjoy the thrill ride, and that's otherwise all that I think that I want to say about this film is I just enjoy it. So, with that said, I think I've spent so much time talking about this movie. Let's get into that spoiler time. Because a lot of people will probably know how this movie exactly goes. I might actually do an adjustment to the way of which that this movie goes, because I want to purposely make certain things more important than what the movie had deemed it to be. So there might be some switching around of scenes purposely. So if people think that this is jarring to be like, well, hey, like this scene took place in blah, 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 blah. I'm like, yeah, so, okay, sure. But this is my variation. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. This is so weird because I never, like, it was kind of weird that, like, the Terminator movies were just so interesting to people. And me going into this one, because I never thought in a million years that I would actually be, at some point, going over this film, just because, like, I don't know, like, some people's impressions on this film are just kind of all over the place. But on top of that, like, I didn't think that I would just be reviewing Terminator films. I thought it would just be like reviewing horror films and whatever, but I ended up just like stumbling upon, hey, how about I just start reviewing Terminator? And then just things worked out. So, with that said, let's go work out what happens in this film. So, really, the thing that I think I deem the most important, we end up having Marcus Wright, who is a death row inmate or a death row prisoner. And it seems we end up having Marcus talking to a girl called Dr. Serena Kogan. And it seems, or Cogan, we seemingly have this doctor talking to Marcus to try and sell over his body to the government. And she says that it's like, yeah, like it's definitely the cat's pajamas if you go and sign up to deliver your body to science. And we end up having Marcus, who ends up looking at this doctor and realizing that it seems that she is going through cancer. And so we end up having Marcus, who says, well, I am more than willing to sign my body over to science if you are to give me a kiss. And so we end up having Marcus and the doctor kissing, and so we end up having the doctor walking off because Marcus says a condescending comment about that must be what death tastes like. So we end up having Marcus signing over his body to this doctor, and so we lead into what is now future-like things, because really that's the only pre-Judgment Day thing that happens within this movie, and then everything else is in future time. So we end up showcasing that Judgment Day did happen, and now this uh, apocalyptic like world, which would remind me of Mad Max Fury Road, is in 2018. And I'm like, well, that was a couple of years ago. Like, the world ended a couple of years ago. I think that's kind of funny. And maybe we just don't know it yet. So, so we go on and we end up having seemingly John Connor is going with this military-esh like team to go into this underground base of the Terminators to get some kind of technology of sorts, or much more knowledge of sorts, but to kind of see like where the Terminators are at with their building of Terminator and so on and so forth. Like, where have all their experiments gone into with the early stages of Skynet and so on and so forth. So we have John Connor who makes his way to this underground facility, and so we end up having to take out a Terminator seemingly from Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines, this big bulky giant looking machine. And so we end up having the military taking this Terminator down, and so they end up going into into this base that seems very early stages of Skynet and whatever what have you. So we end up having this military force crack into this computer, and we end up finding out that it seems that they are working on the Arnold Schwarzenegger Terminator, and it seems that Christian Bale realizes that this thing is much more worse than they could have imagined or speculated upon. And so we end up having also seeing a lot of people and or cadavers being experimented on, and this is again very early stages of Skynet and early stages of Terminators. So we end up having eventually where John Connor is to be called off to have him go and check what is going on up above, because it seems like there had been no response from anybody. And the worst line delivery that I've ever heard in a film, and now that I'm reminded of this line, this is going to haunt me until I can like forget about it. So we end up having this superior of John Connor who is barking orders at Connor to tell him, hey man, go and tell those guys that they need to give me a response, even if they're dead. That is the dumbest line that I have ever heard in my life. That even if they're dead, they have to respond to him to let him know what's going on. The most garbageous line that I've ever heard in a movie. But that bugs the crap out of me. And I hope that someday, fairly soon, I will forget about that line, because that haunts me. That haunts my dreams. So, tell those guys up there to give me a response, even if they're dead. Oh my god. Just such a garbagey thing to do. So, we end up having John Connor, who ends up going topside, to have seemingly these HKs, or these hunter-killer machines, going and setting off a bomb within this underground headquarters that ends up basically caving everything in. We end up having John Connor going into a helicopter to try and stop some of these Terminators from attacking this environment. And we end up having the military force ending up trying to go to the surface, but they get there a little too late and they end up being killed. And so John Connor ends up with this big explosion that ends up sending his helicopter into a tizzy, and then eventually the helicopter ends up crashing. And so unfortunately, we end up having John having to fight out this this Terminator that is without legs. So we end up just having this Terminator that is crawling its way to John Connor, just grabbing him, tossing him to the ground, and just trying to get a little nibble of John Connor. And so we end up having John Connor, who ends up trying to fire upon this Terminator's face and tries as much as humanly possible to try to get this Terminator down. And eventually he just kind of like body weights it. He kind of uses his body weight to try and prevent this Terminator from getting to him. To where eventually he ends up sliding, or he ends up kind of getting away from this Terminator to eventually go back to the helicopter to get the big gun of the helicopter and shoot this Terminator till it's dead. But I hope that Terminator gives that military guy a response, because he's dead. God, that's so goofy. So we end up having the military force ending up giving John Connor a little hello. So we end up having the military force asking, like, well, hey, John Connor, is anybody still alive or anybody down there besides you, John Connor? And John Connor's like, no, like, I'm the only one left. I'm the only one alive. There's only one. And so we end up having it to where John Connor is to forcibly walk his way to get to an extraction point for him to be able to get picked up. So we end up having John Connor going into this helicopter to get picked up. And so we end up having John Connor that desperately needs to go and see his people. General Ashdown, what a weird name, who's played by Michael Ironside. And so we end up having John Connor flying a helicopter to get to this submarine, and we end up having John Connor saying, like, dude, like, I need to talk to them, they need to surface now with their submarine. And they said, no, like, you're giving away our location, like no, like go away. And we end up having John Connor's like, dude, you need to get some divers down here, because I'm going to jump, I don't care, I need to talk to you. So we end up having John, who ends up going and is going to be within the submarine, and we end up having General Ashdown that is just kind of really annoyed by John Connor, to the point to where we end up having the general pulling a gun on John Connor to basically tell him, it's like, well, hey, like, I'm more than willing to have our fates change by killing you. Like, so, like, make sure that, like, you're not going to be pulling any of this crap anymore. Because, like, I will purposely go and kill you, John Connor, to just hope that everything eventually just gets resolved. Because fate is what we make. So while John is doing a little chitty chat with his generals, we end up having a man who might be familiar to some people called Marcus Wright, who ends up digging out of the rubble to scream and yell naked in the mud. And he's like, ha! So we have Marcus Wright, who ends up seeing a guy that has these things called clothes. And so Marcus goes and takes these clothes and heads out to eventually find people. Any number of people that still exist. We end up having a tour. Marcus Wright doesn't know anything of this future. He had died quite a bit of time before this all kicked off. So whenever Marcus is seemingly to be around things like Terminators or Hunter-Killers or whatever, we have it to where Marcus is really just oblivious. But we also have it to where Marcus is really just a stubborn person, where if someone is to tell him, oh no, you can't do that, there's no way for you to be able to do that, he's just going to be like, watch me. Like, watch me do this. Like, I am just going to just nail it out of the park. Watch me. I'm going to go do this anyways. Go f yourself, because I'm gonna go and beat this thing, because that's what I do. That's what I do. So, and that's I really love Marcus's aggressiveness. Man, if he was like Wolverine and just popped out those claws, man, would that be fun. Within this movie, they're like, "Oh my God, he's a Terminator because he has metal claws." Oh my God, whoa! I honestly think that he would actually be perfect to be Wolverine, but I just don't think that that would actually happen because I think they would probably cast somebody else. I honestly would probably think that Carl Urban would probably be a really good choice as Wolverine, but that is to be its own choice of casting whoever it ends up being. They're probably going to try to go younger, anyways. What a garbage thing to do. So, going on to this movie, we end up having Marcus Wright, who ends up just walking around town in LA. He's like, yeah, you know what? I'm gonna go and see if I can get a froyo or or I can get some lemonade. Is there a sweet tea in here anywhere? And so we have Marcus just kind of like trotting around town. And so we end up having a Terminator that seems to want to go out of its way to, of course, do what Terminators do, which is kill things. And so we end up having Marcus going like, hey buddy, hey Terminator, how's it going? Are you gonna kill me today? What are you gonna do? And so we end up having this Terminator turning around, and so we end up having Kyle Reese jump out of nowhere to grab Marcus and and get him to a safer location. And we end up having Kyle, who's like, God, are you insane? Like, come with me if you want to live. And so we end up having Marcus following Kyle, and so we end up having eventually where it seems that Kyle and Star seemingly have some traps to take down these Terminators. It seems that we end up having at some point Kyle Reese has this one trap that is to tie up this Terminator and turn him upside down to where Kyle and Mark are to try to make their escape. And so we end up having this Terminator shooting off its own leg and then trying to make it to Kyle and or Marcus. And so we eventually have it to where Star eventually lets loose some other trap that ends up going and dropping this heavy piece of, I think it's like a car piece of sorts, that ends up just falling onto this Terminator and taking it down indefinitely. So we end up having it to where Kyle is to eventually turn a gun on Marcus, and we end up having Marcus who delivers this line, if you're going to point a gun at me, you better be ready to pull the trigger. And eventually we end up having Kyle eventually repeat that line somewhere down the road to sound really, really cool, because Marcus sounded really, really cool when he delivered that line. So we eventually have it to where Marcus ends up completely disarming Kyle, and so we end up eventually having Marcus, who ends up showing Kyle how no one is going to be able to ever take his shotgun from him again by a string-like magic trick, to where Marcus ends up pointing the shotgun at Kyle, and Kyle ends up taking the shotgun from Marcus, but Marcus has a little string at the end of the shotgun to where no one could be able to take the shotgun from him. So, whoa! I'm gonna pause here for a second. All right. Dropped my phone. That's what happens when I'm not doing this on like a desk or whatever. So anyways, so we go on and we go along and we have seemingly we end up having Kyle, Marcus, and Star deciding that they need to go out and find this John Connor character, because it seems that we end up having John Connor finding out that Kyle Reese is number one for the Terminators wanting to kill him. It seems that there is a list of certain targets that the Terminators want to hit, and it seems that John Connor is number two and Kyle Reese is number one. So we end up having John Connor hearing this information and desperately running to a radio that is to call out to people to basically say like, hey, like if you're listening to this, you are the resistance. And so we end up having John relay to anybody that will hear it what is the actual technical way to take down these Terminators by jabbing something into their neck. It seems that that quite easily takes them down to where they have problems trying to attack people. He also kind of mentions any number of things to kind of motivate people and like say how valuable they are and blah 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 blah. While this is going on, we end up having Marcus, who is coincidentally simultaneously at the same time trying to figure out how to work a radio, which he seems to be able to easily do. And so we end up having Marcus, who is to go and construct a radio that will be able to listen in on John Connor. And so we end up having Kyle, Marcus, and Star all wanting to go and find this John Connor. And so we end up having these people go on a road trip to try and find this John Connor or any other people of the Resistance, because we end up having it to where Star and Kyle Reese are a bulk of the LA branch of the Resistance, because Marcus is kind of like condescendingly say like, well, hey, this is the LA branch, like you guys got this, right? Like if anything goes down, like you got this. Kyle's like, dude, there's only two of us, and even with that, so we go along, and so we end up having them go along on the road trip, and so it seems that we end up eventually having them try to hotwire a car, which ends up having a radio go off, which ends up showcasing a song which Marcus is fairly familiar with, which Kyle and Star are not, because they, I guess, are not very familiar with music. So, evidently, it seems that this radio station had triggered one of the scouts, and so we end up having Kyle and Marcus trying to fight off this scout within this Jeep, and eventually they end up figuring out how to fight off this Jeep, and they end up in some home with some other seemingly survivors that eventually are going to turn their guns on these people because they're thinking that these people are trying to steal from them. But eventually there's an old lady that realizes how young these two kids are, and so she ends up giving them food and all kinds of things, because it's like, well, like, these kids are young. They're not here to try and take anything and steal anything from us. Like, they're just here to just make it by, to where eventually they're going off on their own. And so, like, really we have one lady who actually sees and realizes that, like, hey, we're humans, they're humans. It's like, we need everybody that we can to survive this thing, to where not everyone sees it that way in this place, in this establishment. But let's put a pen in that. So we end up having John Connor, who is to go and try to consistently figure out how this new signal works. It seems that the Resistance tries to grab one of the like Terminators that are in the ocean or in the water. They end up stealing one of these Terminators and tying it onto a bed, and so they end up using the signal. And it seems like the signal has to consistently be on, or it does not kill the actual Terminator. It just, like, pauses this Terminator from doing whatever it was supposed to do. And then they realize that and they're like, oh, okay, well, considering this signal does work, now we have to do an even bigger test on something even bigger, right around where the Terminators would normally be at. Like, we got to get like the biggest test of this to make sure that it actually does work. So we end up having there being plans to eventually have a submarine that is General Ashdown submarine. We end up having them just blaringly using the signal, like thinking no different that, oh, like the Terminators won't come to them, we'll be protected, so on and so forth. But eventually they don't actually realize that what this actual signal eventually does do the more they test this thing. So, going on, now back with Marcus and Kyle and Star. So, we now have a gigantic hunter-killer mech-like thing coming down into the environment of which that they are at. Like this big giant robotic thing that has arms and legs and can shoot out motorcycles at the back of its feet. We end up having this thing going and attacking this environment of which that Marcus and Kyle is in. We end up having Marcus and Kyle and Star kind of running from out of this environment to have somebody mention that they are the ones that brought them here. And eventually this guy ends up just getting hit by a car and ends up trying to like people are just scrambling and running off. Every single one of them are all trying to run off into a vehicle of sorts, and we end up having this big, huge hunter-killer mech character that is honestly just shooting every single one of these vehicles down, to where Kyle and Marcus make the consensus that they can't just leave. They have to take this giant mech thing out. And so we end up having them in their plan to go and get a gas tanker and shove it into this Terminator, and then eventually just try to blow up the tanker, which we end up having Kyle trying to shoot the tanker, and it doesn't quite work. So we end up having Marcus, who ends up tossing a flare of sorts to hit the fire to have this explode. And so right as that happens, we end up having this mech Terminator going and shooting out some motorcycle-like Terminators, some mini Terminators. And so we end up having Marcus, Kyle, and Star all driving off because they assume or assess that, well, like, I think we've made it since we took down this thing, I think we'll be fine. And there's the big, huge explosion. So we have Marcus, Kyle, Star, the LA branch, let's just say. We have them go on to drive and think that, yeah, like, they made it, but eventually we end up seeing the motorcycle Terminators. And so I guess we can call them Terminator cycles? Terminator cycles? Let's say that. So we have these Terminator cycles who are to go on to try to get, of course, the LA branch. And so we end up having them seemingly on some tow truck. So we end up having at first them trying to try to figure out if they can blow up some of the vehicles that are nearby, and like we end up having Marcus, who ends up trying to drive some of the vehicles to fling over his plow or over his vehicle, because there's like a plow at the end of it to where the vehicle just kind of tosses over, and he thinks that will stop actually the Terminator cycles, but doesn't quite exactly work. To where the point is they end up dropping the ball of the tow truck to just kind of fall and eventually tie up this Terminator cycle to where he's kind of like jockeying in between these vehicles, and he's kind of getting crushed. and they figure, oh, okay, great, we did it, we figured it out. But then eventually they end up also getting to the point to have this big, giant, huge, flying like Terminator that ends up, of course, getting it to where we end up having the Terminator cycle that ends up flying into this flying hunter killer and wrapping itself around it and kind of destroying this flying hunter killer thing. And we end up now having this tow truck which is almost kind of like falling off of this bridge, and so now we end up having forcibly Kyle and Star having to fall off said tow truck, and so they are basically falling into what is to basically be maybe their deaths, but instead they end up getting picked up by some other hunter killer flying vehicle, and end up being taken into this hunter killer thing to be flown off to the Skynet facility. So we end up having Marcus going out of his way to try and get to have a jump on this vehicle, grabbing an axe and jumping onto this vehicle, trying to get his friends free, but he eventually just is not able to get them free. Eventually he just ends up going and falling off this vehicle whatsoever. We end up having a bunch of Air Force like jets that are kind of flying around to try to take these hunter killers down, and we eventually have seemingly one Air Force person who is Blair Williams that eventually is unsuccessful, and so she has to eject out of her jet, and so she ends up kind of she ends up landing with her parachute almost on some like electrical tower like thing, to where it seems like she ends up getting her parachute caught in this thing. We end up having also Marcus Wright, who ends up getting dunked into some coincidentally, luckily for him, some water sorts, where he ends up kind of getting kind of yo-yoed or kind of gets like flung a couple times and then eventually lands into the water. So we end up having Marcus, who decides, well, since I can't get to Kyle Reese and my friend, I might as well go and see this other military person to see if she has any if she has any information, or if she's a useful person. So we ended up having Marcus, who tries to help seemingly Blair get free, and it seems Marcus also is pumping Williams for information. And so we seemingly end up having Marcus, who is easily and quickly attracted to Blair. It seems that at one point he is very interested in like asking her, like, hey, are you hurt? And she's like, no, I'm fine, it's just nothing. So we end up having both Marcus and Blair going off together to try and make a hike to make it to the Resistance headquarters, because it seems that Marcus was going to go all by himself to make it to Skynet, and we end up having Blair going like, well, hey, like, it's a little like dumb to go all there by yourself. Like, if anything, like, you should probably go and talk to John Connor. He'll be more than happy to be able to help you try to rescue these people. So we end up having it to where Marcus and Blair are to settle down for one night because it seems that there is going to be a 2-day hike to make it to the Resistance. And so we end up having it eventually where it's pouring down rain, and so it seems for one reason or another that Blair otherwise decides that, I guess, that she is not clearly wet enough, because I'm assuming or assessing that I'm like, man, are these characters going to get like pneumonia or something horrible during the shooting of this part of this film? Because good God, is rain just like pouring down on them? I know it's probably fake rain because it feels like that or it looks like that. It looks too heavy to be actual rain. But anyways, so we end up having Blair, who is to basically start to strip down right in front of Marcus, and then eventually we end up having Blair kind of touching over her chest, and she just kind of looks over at Marcus, just kind of like, huh? Like, are you enticed by a half-naked woman? And Marcus is like, well, yeah, of course I would be. Wouldn't anybody? Like, and so we really have it to where Blair is just bizarrely like stripping down, I guess, to uh, try and uh, try and like make herself, I guess, a little less dirty looking. Double entendre. Anyways, so we end up having eventually where Blair ends up deciding to put back her clothes on, and then it seems that eventually while Blair is trying to first aid herself and try to like get all of her stuff out that she has kept with her, it seems we have a bunch of humans that all decide to go after Blair and seem to want a go at her, let's just say. And it seems that Blair lets her gun fall off to the side, and so eventually one of the goons ends up grabbing her gun and pointing it at her. So we end up having Blair, who is just like, well, like, I guess I'll just have to fight these people. Like, I guess that's what I'm just gonna have to do. And so we end up having Blair, who is smart about this, and ends up telling the goon, it's like, well, hey, look at that, no bullets. Really cueing back to the Die Hard movie, to where I always go with that line. But we have Blair who tells the goon that there is actually no bullets in the gun, and surefire enough, there is none. And so we end up having Blair who is fighting off these guys, but of course, she is of course outnumbered. And so we end up having Blair trying to take these guys down herself, but failing. And so Marcus ends up jumping in and breaking a piece of wood off of one guy. He ends up just like really going and beating the living crap at a bunch of these guys. And we end up having it to where one of the goons is mentioning like, well, hey man, like you can't win the war by killing me. And so we end up having Blair who ends up shooting this guy in the leg and to just try to scare them off, which that's what it does. And so we end up having it to where Blair seems to be very much won over by Marcus to the point of her really trying to conveniently figure out ways to get closer to Marcus, even to the point to where she ends up lighting a fire. She ends up wanting to hug on to him to mention it's like, oh no, like don't get any funny ideas. I just need body heat. Sure, but you otherwise also undressed yourself right in front of this man moments earlier. So which is it? Like, are you playing around or are you playing around? You know what I'm saying? So we end up seemingly having it to where Blair is to convince Marcus that he is a good guy, and we end up having Marcus who is like, well, I'm not a good guy. Like, I've done some things. And we end up having it to where Blair is like, well, then you are a good guy and you just don't know it yet. Like, all this, like, trickery of words to just, like, convince Marcus that, like, hey, he didn't have to save Blair, and he didn't have to take down these three guys, and he didn't have to also comfort her for body warmth. He could have been a crab apple or whatever about any of this stuff, but he wasn't, because of course, beautiful woman by your side, you're just like, heck yeah, like I would definitely let her take my arm and whichever. Hilarious. So we have Blair and we have Marcus who are making their way to the base. It seems that they, unfortunately, are right around a minefield to make their way to make it to their headquarters. It seems that if anyone were to come close that were of metal, it seems that the metal mines would eventually stick to said person and explode. So we end up having Marcus and we end up having Blair who end up walking their way to make it to the resistance. And we end up finding out that Marcus is actually having a leg prosthetic. And so that's what triggers this mine. And so we end up having the resistance uh, going and trying to rush to try to help out Marcus, but then they realize once they are helping him that there's a slight little problem with Marcus. That they end up finding out that he basically has a metal like skeleton, that he basically is a Terminator, that he was probably sent there to kill everyone, and hurrah, hurrah. So we end up having Common who ends up bapping this guy with a gun. And so we end up having Marcus waking up, just kind of hanging into a piece of car parts. And so we end up having John Connor asking Marcus, like, who is he? Where is he from? Like, if he likes kittens or not. Do you like kittens? No. Swear to me. Swear to me like you like kittens. So we go on and we have John Connor who is talking to Marcus and he's saying like we've been at war since forever and that you tried to kill me, you've tried to kill my mother, and you've tried to kill any number of other people. And we end up having John, who is trying to ask Marcus who he is and when was he made and when was he whatever. And we end up having Marcus telling him, like, dude, I was born during this time period. Like, man, I had a mother, I had a father, and this and that. And we end up having Marcus really just going out of his way to convince John that he isn't what he thinks he is. And so we end up having Blair eventually asking what is to happen with Marcus. And they're like, well, dude, he's obviously going to get disassembled. Like, he's going to get killed. And so we end up having Blair who ends up deciding to go and try to help Marcus escape because she saw a man, she didn't see a machine. And so we have Blair who helps Marcus escape. We end up having Marcus who ends up having to do this creative mine-like thing to where Blair ends up like putting a wire down to let all these mines eventually explode. We end up having this Blair and Marcus making this way to this Jeep, which ends up exploding, and so they end up just kind of running to try and get out of here. And eventually we have John Connor, who is on a helicopter trying to get to Marcus, and eventually his helicopter ends up going down. Blair ends up getting caught by the resistance and ending up being imprisoned and put into some brig or something. And so we end up having John Connor's helicopter crashing, and so we end up having John Connor, who is trying to use every single weapon at his disposal to try and fight his way through this water of all of these fish-like Terminators. And so we end up having John kind of shooting these Terminators till his last bullet, and we end up having Marcus swooping in and trying to protect John from one of these Terminators. And so we end up having Marcus, who mentions to John previously that he could have actually killed Kyle Reese at some point. He could have done him in LA. And so we end up having Marcus, who is trying to convince John Connor that he is going to try and make his way to get to Kyle Reese, to go to Skynet and try to take that whole thing down. And so John Connor's like, well, how is it that you can be able to do that? And Marcus goes like, well, look at me. Like, I'm a Terminator. Like, I can do this. And so we end up having John who's like, okay, well, like, let's just say that I believe you. Here's a thing that we can communicate by, and like I'll see like what I can do. And so Marcus ends up starting to swim off, and we end up having John ask him, it's like, what are you? And Marcus is like, I don't know. So Marcus goes off to try and find this Skynet headquarters. It seems that he is ushered in because he's a Terminator. So Marcus goes to Skynet headquarters and ends up getting a download of all the information of Terminators and everything that had happened. He got like an update of all the information that he can. He also had exactly found out exactly where Kyle Reese is in this headquarters and this place and whatever and what have you. I skipped around about the whole like Kyle Reese being in the actual killer vehicle and all that garbage. I didn't really care about any of that. We can just skip that. It's not really important. So, and plus him like making his way to this facility, I didn't really just care about that either. Yeah, there were some people that ended up getting shot because they tried to escape, but there's not really any importance of that at all whatsoever to me, really. So we end up having Marcus, who ends up infiltrating this base, and so he ends up giving John Connor the information of where Kyle is. And so Kyle ends up going and trying to commandeer one of the Terminator cycles and makes his way to these headquarters to try and figure out how to get to Kyle Reese. And so we also have it to where John Connor was talking to General Ashdown about trying to avoid taking down the Skynet facility because Kyle Reese was there, and General Ashdown was going to do it regardless of any civilian life that was actually there. But eventually we end up having we end up having John Connor, who ends up convincing people to not release one bomb or to not do anything until John Connor can get everyone out, and then bomb the crap out of it afterwards. So we end up having Marcus, who is to be seemingly reassimilated into the Terminator facility. And so we end up having Marcus, who ends up getting his skin back, who ends up looking all perfect and prim and proper. And so we now end up having the doctor, Selena Kogan, who is talking to Marcus as this computer. And so Marcus is like, well, I thought you were dead. And so really we have it to where Skynet is just looking like any number of people that will make Marcus more at ease or more calm when talking to him. And so really we have it to where it's just a machine over human skin and whatever. And so we eventually have it to where Marcus is talking to this doctor, and eventually she is trying to convince him that he had been the one Terminator to trick both Kyle and John Connor to come to this facility for them to go and kill them off. She basically mentions how this character was the perfect infiltrator to trick these people to come here so they can be killed off. And so we end up having Marcus, who ends up getting really upset about that, and he ends up deciding to pull some part of his Terminator-esque like chip or whatever of sorts out of his head to have this Skynet not control him. And so we end up having Skynet basically telling Marcus, it's like, well, you're not going to be able to save Kyle Reese or John Connor. Like, it's not going to happen. And so we end up having Marcus telling the Terminator, it's like, well, watch me. Like, watch me go and save John Connor. Watch me save all these people. I will save the gosh darn world. That's what I'll do. And so we end up having Marcus, who ends up taking some little seed or whatever, and he ends up flinging it into the giant computer screen, which ends up bashing it. And so Marcus ends up making his way hero-wise to otherwise help out the resistance. So we end up having John Connor, who is ending up making his way through this facility, and he ends up trying to free all these civilians. And he's also ending up yelling out, hey, anybody see John Connor? Anybody John Connor? That John Connor guy? And so while John Connor is consistently going through this facility trying to find Kyle Reese, we end up having eventually Kyle Reese ends up getting rescued or ends up getting released. And so we end up having, because Kyle ends up going and jabbing this Terminator in the neck, of course, to like showcase that he learned what John had told him. And so we end up having John, who ends up stumbling upon the Arnold Schwarzenegger Terminator from the very first film, to showcase to us that it's like, okay, well, this is a naked Arnold and he's CGI'd. And I don't know how I still feel about this. Like, if anything, like, I appreciate that they're really kind of reminding us of the very first film, but also, like, it's a naked CGI Arnold Schwarzenegger. I don't know how exactly to feel about that. Plus, also, it looks really like this Arnold is much more bigger, I think, than the original Arnold was in the original movie. Like, you could say he looks way bigger than John Connor, and like the size doesn't seem right. And I could be wrong, because who knows how exactly Arnold size-wise was in the very first original Terminator, or people could think that, like, dude, this CGI version was way bigger and it doesn't make sense. Because we eventually have it to where John Connor ends up going and eventually, like, using this grenade launcher thing to eventually peel off every single bit of skin from this Terminator anyways. So I guess it doesn't matter, because reasonably, this is a naked Arnold. And so also we have to, like, basically take off all the skin, because naked Arnold. So we end up having to do a Terminator thing to just kind of quickly, like, get to that that metal skeleton, so we can kind of just bypass, like, hey, there's only so many shadows that we can put onto this guy, and there's only so many close-ups that we can do, and plus, like, we need an action sequence going on in here, and so on and so forth. So we end up having it to where John Connor is to try and take this via grenade launcher, try to take this Terminator down. Eventually we end up having John Connor trying to slow this thing down via lava and all kinds of things, and or magma or whatever the case may be. And so we eventually end up having John Connor, who ends up bumping into Kyle Reese. And so we have John, who's like, hey, what's your name? Kyle Reese? Okay, let's get out of here. And so we eventually have it to where John Connor has to take down this facility. And so we end up having John Connor, who ends up trying to get Kyle Reese to a safe location for him to get rescued. And so we end up having John having to forcibly take and try to wrap some things around some batteries of the Terminators, which of course reminds us of Terminator 3 Rise of the Machine, where Arnold was taking out that piece from his chest and tossing it out of the car because it was going to explode, it was going to erupt, and so on and so forth, to where we end up showcasing that in this movie, where it's kind of like a nuclear battery kind of thing. And this will be the thing that will detonate and or take down this environment. So we end up having uh, Kyle, who is to go off, and they have these like one-liners to one another where Kyle is saying like, "Well, I don't want to leave you," and John Connor's like, "You never did." I love you, Pop Pop, future Pop Pop, that I never actually get to see. But how many iterations have we had it to where at some point John Connor has had time with his dad within these movies? It's kind of fun. But anyways, so I honestly think that they should have honestly joked around that with that a little bit more within Terminator Genesis, where eventually like John Connor should have made jokes about Kyle Reese being his father and should have joked around about that a little bit more, but they didn't. But anyways, so we end up having it to where John is to have to forcibly take down this Terminator. And it seems that eventually this Terminator ends up scarring John's face. And so we end up having it to where Marcus comes into the fray to try and take down this Terminator. And unfortunately, we end up having it to where the Terminator ends up getting the upper hand on Marcus, where Marcus ends up getting seemingly electrified to where it takes him out of the battle, to where eventually the Terminator goes back onto John Connor, and John Connor tries to take him out but ends up failing. So he's like, well, I got to scramble back to Marcus to try to get his heart started again. So John is like smacking onto Marcus, just like, come on! Come on! And then we end up having it to where John Connor ends up taking some wires and shocking Marcus back to life, and he's like, come on! And then we end up having Marcus, who ends up coming back to life, ending up taking he ends up taking a metal piece that was shoved into John Connor's chest, and Marcus ends up taking it from John Connor's chest to put into the Terminator's neck to try and rip this Terminator's head off, which of course he is successful with doing. So we end up having Marcus, who ends up grabbing onto John Connor and like tossing him over his shoulder, basically. But that's not actually what happens. He ends up just kind of like grabbing him, and they end up kind of like jockeying together or whatever. So we end up having Marcus and John get into this helicopter, and so they end up flipping the switch to explode the whole Skynet facility, and so we end up having to scramble to get John Connor into a hospital of sorts, whatever the future hospital is now. That's where they're technically doing. And so we end up finding out that John Connor, like, things don't look good for him. And so we end up having it to where John Connor is to tell Kyle Reese, it's like, well, hey, man, like, you've earned your resistance armband, because we end up having it to where Marcus ended up getting a coat from some resistance guy, and Kyle Reese is all like bent out of shape because this guy did not earn his badge or did not earn his wristband, and so on and so forth. So, and eventually Kyle needed to earn his, which he does coincidentally by the end of this film. So we end up having it to where Marcus is a person that is consistently like, well, hey, man, I need to make a second chance. Like, I need to be able to really do my best. And so we end up having Marcus, who decides to give up his heart to John Connor. Because Blair is like, no, like, I wanted to make babies with that man. And Marcus is like, well, yeah, but, like, I was actually supposed to be dead all along. And so, reasonably, like, I should go back to, like, doing the right thing and giving Christian Bale my heart. Hopefully he doesn't die in the whole procedure because I don't think there's another spare heart that he could have. Hopefully everything is copacetic. Hopefully our blood is all the same. Hopefully every piece of medical thing would say that like our hearts are compatible because hopefully something doesn't go horribly awry. So we end up having Marcus who ends up going and sleeping it off to go and give John Connor his heart, and that is basically how this movie tends to end, with just a successful everybody wins, and Marcus is dead at the end of this, which I was like, man, that kind of sucks. Like I actually liked Marcus, but I guess you can have to understand why Marcus wasn't in any other actual movie past this, but also every single Terminator usually has to die. Like the Terminator that has to be the good guy always has to die at the end of every single Terminator movie, with the exclusion of some of the more recent ones or some of the more like later movies. Like they just decide to just like, oh no, we'll just make Arnold unstoppable, or we'll make him just whatever fits the story, just because he has to be the bestest of the bestest of Terminators, and like we want him in other Terminator movies anyways. So with that said, I'm going to get out of here. I didn't realize how long this was going to take to talk about this, but I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.